I think we're in a golden age of Final Fantasy. A while back, I talked about how 2023 and 2024 are massively important for the future of Final Fantasy because there are a bunch of massive projects all coming out shortly after the other. You had Final Fantasy 16, 7 Rebirth, 16's DLC, and we also have a new expansion for Final Fantasy 14, the MMORPG, entitled Dawn Trail, coming out this summer. And while we are still waiting for Dawn Trail, it's shaping up to be what could, in my opinion, be Final Fantasy's best expansion, at least content-wise. Pending a few things, but I'm still optimistic. And when you kind of think on it, this constant cycle of hype and amazing game releases, I wouldn't say is on par, but is similar to that absolute reign of glory that Final Fantasy had back in the late 90s and early 2000s, where every year it was just Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, let's drop an MMORPG on the PS2 for some reason. Why not? Because we can just do that, apparently. And the thing with the modern era of Final Fantasy, or this, at least this new modern era of Final Fantasy, is that it's extremely polarizing, but in my opinion, extremely high quality as well, and shockingly different to one another. I love Final Fantasy 16 and 7 Rebirth, but they are wildly different games in terms of content offering, narrative, tone, atmosphere, even art style to some degree. But they nail this underlying feeling of being a Final Fantasy game and releasing so close to one another, and it had me kind of have this moment where I took a step back and said, you know, it's kind of funny how the only main critiques and issues that I have with this modern era of Final Fantasy is that it isn't available on multiple platforms on launch. We always have to wait for a PC release or a multi-platform port or whatever. But I don't want to dwell on that discussion today because I've talked about that before. I want to talk about why I view this new era of Final Fantasy so positively. But first, let's talk about what is this era? What am I talking about exactly? I'm going to be a bit arbitrary here, but I'm going to be mainly talking about Shadowbringers and Endwalker, the Final Fantasy 14 expansions, Final Fantasy 15, 16, 7 Remake, and 7 Rebirth. All of these games, in my opinion, are feature-complete, expansive, tell incredible narratives in of themselves, and also feel wildly different to one another. I think the weakest game of the list that I just talked about is 15, yet 15 was the game that got me into Final Fantasy to begin with in a lot of ways. It was my first Final Fantasy, and while I view it to be a deeply flawed game, I have a lot of nostalgia and fondness for the world and the characters overall. I think the pacing is its weakest issue in the back half, but the vibe that it gave off of just going on a road trip with the boys and those 4 main characters, anything pertaining to those 4 guys, they absolutely nailed. There was a lot that 15 got wrong. I think the combat, more often than not, is clunky. But I also think that the ending is one of my favorite video game endings of all time. Not in terms of like mechanics or gameplay, but in terms of story, because it focuses in on the 4 boys. At the end of the journey, at the end of the road, it knew what it got right, and chose to focus in on that aspect. And while 15 will always be a game that's looked on with both love and just disdain, I'm gonna look at 15 and always go back to it and just say, you know what, this world is gorgeous. Yeah, the open world may be empty in a lot of places, but it's fun just being in the world, driving around in the car, blaring the Nier Automata theme like Weight of the World, warp striking everywhere. It's fun. It's not a perfect game by any stretch of the imagination, and in my opinion, if I'm taking a step back and trying to view this modern era of Final Fantasy I've laid out objectively, I would say it's the weakest entry. However, it's arguably the game I'm going to look at with some of the most fondest memories with, because it's what got me into Final Fantasy to begin with. I've said before, I think Final Fantasy XIV is the greatest video game story ever told in the medium. Let alone Final Fantasy, I hold it extremely highly, and it's largely because of Shadowbringers and Endwalker. It is a monolithic task to accurately describe why Shadowbringers and Endwalker are such a good narrative and conclusion to a storyline that had started since 1.0 and 2.0 with A Realm Reborn. A 10-year-long narrative culminating with Endwalker. And Shadowbringers by itself could easily be one of the best, if not the best. Actually, I've said this before, I still kind of hold to this opinion. Shadowbringers is the best RPG story ever told. Then you have Endwalker, which makes it even better in my opinion. And in the form of an MMORPG, Final Fantasy XIV was one of the biggest examples that just because it's a game as an MMORPG is not an excuse to tell a poor story. Because some of the best, and in my opinion, the best story to ever be told in a video game format came in the form of an MMORPG. And you pair that with a group of developers that actively try and take feedback into account to make the game better and iterate on the game throughout the patch cycles of each expansion to make it better. I don't think Endwalker's been the best in terms of, like, endgame systems myself, but in terms of story, I've been hooked since the beginning. And then you have Final Fantasy XVI, which, in my opinion, is one of the most epic stories I've ever played. It's a game of moments, of brilliantly written dialogue and amazing voice acting, and an extremely human storyline juxtaposed with these larger-than-life Final Fantasy infused elements. These giant icon boss fights with awesome one-liners and just these overall spectacles and vistas where you had these encounters and you had these moments that make the entire game worth it. I think 16 has some issues, namely at the end. I wasn't a fan of Odin in terms of the boss fight or the actual powers you got from Odin, but the DLC to 16 is really good. Not the best story-wise at all, in my opinion. It's kind of forgettable in that regard. However, in terms of the boss fights, Omega and Leviathan are two of my favorites. And do I even need to talk about the Titan and Bahamut fights from the base game? When 16 goes full adrenaline, there's no other game out there that, in my opinion, is that action-packed and is that exciting. Not just in terms of what's going on in the screen, but in terms of you playing these fights, you doing these cool things yourself. That's a hard balance to hit, and in my opinion, I think 16 nails it more often than not. Is it perfect? No. Was it a breath of fresh air, and I'm glad that they tried something different? Absolutely. Will I always remember Final Fantasy 16? Yes. Even the crossover event in Final Fantasy 14, where they pretty much just took the Ifrit fight one for one and did it there, was hype as hell. Clive is one of my favorite main characters in all of Final Fantasy. Same with Noctis, funnily enough. I think the characters of 16 overall felt extremely human more often than not. You felt their struggle, and the voice acting was so up to par, and not even par, so above and beyond the Call of Duty in this regard, that it added so much emotion and weight to each scene. You pair that with the amazing music that 16 had as well, thanks to Soken and crew, and it makes the entire experience better because all of these individual pillars are working together to support the overall structure. And then we talk about Remake and Rebirth. Games built on mystery, revisiting one of the classic Final Fantasies from 1997, one of the most important games, if not the most important game in the franchise, that catapulted the series' hype and fame and popularity, saying we're going to go back to basics, we're going to tell a new story, we are going to remake this entire story. And to have this much interest and intrigue and mystery, but make it feel earned as well, with amazing characters. I think every character in Remake and Rebirth is better off in Remake and Rebirth in terms of being a character and the characterization than they were in the original. That's not a knock on the original, because the original is one of my favorite games of all time. That is just a testament to how highly I view Remake and Rebirth in terms of how they're able to feel like Final Fantasy VII, but lean into it and expand on it. Not be afraid of the roots they come from, but utilize them as inspiration to say, how can we do this, but even more so. The voice acting is stellar. The facial animations bring everything together. The pacing, the gameplay, the story, amazing. And we go back to one of the main things I think this modern era of Final Fantasy is able to nail so well, and that's spectacle. And the sense of scale of it all. Where you have these giant, larger-than-life fights, or just these really cool fights overall. And sometimes they may not be the best mechanically, like the Leviathan fight from Final Fantasy 15, but they look really good. And sometimes, like in Final Fantasy 16, they may also play really well. I think one of the reasons I love this new era of Final Fantasy so much is because it's leaning into the elements of Final Fantasy that they always got right before. Music, characters, story, and just a sense of scale of it all. Lean into those elements and utilize these new engines and these new graphics and all that, and these new styles of genre for Final Fantasy. Utilize them to such an effective degree to emphasize and further the feeling of being this larger-than-life encounter. That's what I think modern Final Fantasy is able to nail so well. It feels grandiose, not just for the sake of being grandiose, but it feels cool and it works in context as well. They give you cool things to do in story, but also they give you cool things you can do in the gameplay. Like in Final Fantasy 15 with warp striking or summoning all of your armaments for armature and stuff like that. It's so cool. Or like in Remake and Rebirth, how you can pair up certain spells for like quadracast, or just how these fights look and how they play. They're memorable in all the best ways. I don't think Final Fantasy, at least the modern era, nails it all the time, though at the same point and on the same hand, it never has. Because no game is perfect. And if you judge a game only by its weaknesses, you won't be able to appreciate all the strengths. I think Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for instance, is a really frustrating game at times, and I don't think all the minigames are great. But if you focus only on the bad stuff, you ignore all the good stuff as well, because there's a ton of good. And for a franchise that's been around since the 80s, to still feel fresh and new, and still feel like, to me at least, as if it's bringing something unique to the table that no one else in the industry is really bringing to the table to a comparable degree, that says something in my opinion. I wonder where Final Fantasy will go in the future. We still have Part 3 to the remake, and 17 is a giant question mark right now. We have Dawntrail coming up in summer, which I'm greatly looking forward to, but 16's in the rearview mirror. The DLC is done, we are done with 16. But I look back on it in fondness. And whether or not this era extends into the future, or they kind of move into a new era in whatever way or fashion, or a new direction for the franchise, we will have to see. But I'm extremely optimistic overall for the future of Final Fantasy, because they have multiple teams that are capable of putting out amazing games that feel different and unique to one another, but at the end of the day, in my opinion, feel like Final Fantasy. And with that, I think I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure for making that video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, have a great day. Leave a comment down below with your favorite Final Fantasy game ever, and your favorite modern Final Fantasy game. I'd love to hear your thoughts and hear your opinions. Stay safe, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody, until we meet again.